Hi, I'm Sevcan Seçkin, and I'm an assistant professor at Fatih Sultan Mehmet Vakıf University. Today, I'm going to talk about the constraints in institutional translation field and its effects on institutionalization. The data used was taken from my doctoral thesis entitled Constraints, Power Relations in the Field of Institutional Translation in Turkey and Solutions, produced from the focal point of the sociology of translation, written under the supervision of Professor Emine Bogenç Demirel. The aim of this study is to explain the effects of the constraints faced in translation process on institutionalization. So first of all, let's look at the meanings of the concept of constraint and institutionalization. So the term of the constraint is described by many researchers like Koskinen and Kang as rules or norms imposed by the institution. But it's clear that, or this study has revealed that, translators need these guides, these clear rules, clear-cut rules in an institutional setting, especially in decision-making, and they don't regard them as constraints. Translators face many challenges in the translation process, and some of these challenges can be solved in some way by the translator or institution and without any effect on translation product. But there are the ones that cannot be solved during or after the translation process and therefore harmful to the translation product. And these are called as constraints in our study. As for the institutionalization, so you all know that it's the process of making regular and enduring a behavior in an institutional setting. So it's a process of automatization, which is very important in the institutional setting. Our method, the institutional translation, will be discussed in the context of sociology of translation and examined using the three-step model proposed by Pierre Bourdieu in the field analysis. And according to this analysis, first, the position of the field before the power will be analyzed. And the field of power could be a person, an institution, or a group of people having economic and political power. Second, the dominant power relations between positions will be analyzed. Every field has dominant and dominated poles. So here we will look into these positions in the institutional translation field. And the third, the habitus will be analyzed. As for the habitus, it's much more complicated actually, because it's acquired and incorporated in the body in the form of permanent dispositions. So here, this will be some kind of institutionalized person. So what is the institutional translation after all? Translation practice in an institutional field has started to attract attention with sociological studies, as you all know. Today, many institutions need translation to be informed and to disseminate information. It plays a major role, especially in international and supranational institutions. Documents, reports, and official correspondence are the main examples, are the prime examples, or institutional translation. Basically, institutional translation is often described as a controlled action because it's formed by the institution with different tools, such as term lists, style guides, etc. For this reason, it's considered to be in one form and without any problem, with no problem. But the reality is different. This is not the case, actually. Institutional translation contains a rich variety, just like mosaic art. Translation activity of each institution and the purpose of translating are different. They form their own rhythm and color, just like pieces of a mosaic art, but still they are related to each other and constitute one entire mosaic, which is called here institutional translation field. Therefore, this field is neither problem-free nor in one form. Many different challenges and constraints are encountered in the translation process as in other types of translation. And uncovering these problems, these issues, and which will ensure that all pieces of mosaic fit in place in the long term. So our research object is, of course, the institutional translation field, and there are 4 case studies, and these are the European Union Translation Coordination Presidency as a national institution, the Prime Ministry Directorate General of Press and Information as a national institution, again, the Association of Solidarity with Asylum Seekers and Immigrants as a non-governmental institution, and the last one is the United Nations World Food Program as an international institution. The study remained only these 4 institutions because they gave a positive response to have an interview, and a total of 16 people, including translators and managers, were asked 17 questions prepared in advance. And the information obtained in interviews were transcribed and analyzed using MaxQDA, which is a qualitative data analysis program. So here are the constraints in institutional fields. So as a result of this analysis, the constraints were related to the themes that Bourdieu identified in his 3-step model, and they were divided into power relations-based constraints, power-based constraints, power relations-based constraints with 23%, power-based constraints with 6%, and translator-based constraints with 3%. But in accordance with the data obtained from the interviews, 3 more different themes, and which are very important in the institutional field, emerged. And these are institution-based constraints with 49%, almost half of the constraints in the field. And then institutional field-based constraints with 15%, and the last one, text-based constraints with 4%. Here, now, the effects of the constraints on institutionalization, but I'm not going to give all subthemes of the constraints because it takes a long time to tell now. I will present only the ones having an effect on institutionalization. And let's start with institution-based constraints, and there are 5 important codes here. First, the lack of CAT tools in the institutional field and the lack of machine translation. We can say that translation tools in institutions are lacking, and which is also very important for making translating process easier or more automatic. But translators or managers do not have adequate enough information about machine translation or CAT tools, so they don't even use it. They don't even use them, or they don't have even information about them. Time management is another issue in the field because of the heavy workload and the last-minute translation requests of managers. And we also see that revision of translated texts is a problem in the field, especially the final version of the texts. The revision of the final version of the text is lacking or ignored because of the tight deadlines. Perspectives on translation and translator, of course, the institution's perspectives on translation and translator also matter, since translation is regarded something as a piece of cake, and a translator is a secretary or mostly a robot that can who can translate anything instantly, which is not possible, of course. Finally, bad recruitment practices. I mean, recruitment with the help of acquaintances pose a problem in the field. Power relations-based constraints, and we have two important codes here, hierarchy and trust environment. Hierarchy and hierarchical decision making process is a constraint in institutional field, since translators mostly avoid from expressing their opinions before their superiors. It's a problem because they don't even talk about translation or translation process. Trust environment is also related to this communication gap arising from the hierarchical structures. Consequently, they lose faith in institutions, especially in problem solving. Institutional field-based constraints. Here we have, again, two important codes: position classification issues and professionalization. Position classification issues lead to low status of translators, promotion issues, and low prices. The second is that translation is not being, professionalization. It's about the translation is not regulated legally as a profession. So it's a big problem, especially for the status of translators. And power-based constraints, we have, again, two important codes, political power and economic power. You already know there are two dominant powers in the fields, which are political and economic. And the type of institution is also important on which power will be dominant in the field. For example, governmental institutions are more dependent on the political power, while non-governmental institutions are more dependent on economic power. If the field is not independent, so we can't expect it to be autonomous. And the ideal one, of course, is independent and autonomous institution for true institutionalization, which is not possible in practice for the time being. And the last one, text-based constraints. We have only one subtheme here, one code, lack of terminology work. There's a lack of terminology work in the institutions, except the European Union Translation Coordination Presidency. But this process is crucial for automatization. Terms not having exact equivalence and failure to provide terminological unity are very important issues in the institutional field. Sorry, the last one is translator-based constraints, and we have one important code here, lack of translators. It's mostly about non-governmental institutions because there may not be competent interpreters in some language spoken by refugees or immigrants, which pose a big problem in practice. So, all these constraints faced in the institutional field make it difficult for institutions to be institutionalized. And almost half of these constraints arise from the institutions themselves. So paradoxically, the reasons why they aren't institutionalized are institutions themselves. Power relations-based constraints, institutional field-based constraints, and power-based constraints are the other main reasons for non-institutionalization, of course. But we can see that translators and texts do not pose big problems on institutionalization. Okay, that's all what I'm going to say. Thank you for listening to me.